Welcome everyone to another EPERN seminar. It's great to have you all here. Today we will hear a presentation by Linan Peng. Li is an assistant professor of economics at Southern Louisiana University. His main research interests are development economics, economic history, political economy, and regional economics. He received his PhD, as many of us, from George Mason, but his is from 2019. His research has been published in the Journal of Institutional Economics, a Journal of Economics, Race and Policy, Contemporary Economic Policy, and others. And today he will present a paper co-authored with Vincent Geloso. Vincent is also on the call. Hi, Vincent, welcome. And the paper is entitled Postbellum Electoral Politics in California and the Genesis of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So welcome to EPERN, and Li, the screen is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Mara. And let me share my screen here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and listening to my presentation. And today I'm presenting my paper with Vincent, Postbellum Electoral Politics in California and the Genesis of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The topic of immigration in postbellum America has been one of the long-standing interests among both historians and the economic historians. So this is for two main reasons. The first is that the volume of migrants was historically unprecedented. More than 22 million foreigners arrived between 1865 and 1910. And the second is that there was a strong nativist backlash against immigrants that culminated in a series of legislative actions. First against Asian immigrants, well, I should say Chinese to be more specific, in the 1880s, and later against Eastern Europeans. So to explain these backlashes, economists and historians have tended to emphasize how native workers perceive the effects of immigration on their wages, and to see these perceptions as the main incentive to mobilize politically to find a way to reduce immigration. However, there is a problem with this narrative. Right? Large numbers of immigrants were entering the U.S. as early as the 1840s, and the perception of their negative effects on wages were present by the 1850s. For example, in the gold mine industry in California by Chinese, right? And the nativist backlash was immediate, but it never translated into any form of anti-immigration policy at the federal level until 1880s. So what policies were adopted occur at the state level, and when they were now overturned by the courts, right? Even the most extreme policies were relatively modest in both scope and effect. For example, California, the mining industry, the state just charged the Chinese miner about $3 a month per head tax, and those are close to 4 decades separating the beginning of the nativist backlash and the adoption of the anti-Chinese, anti-immigration rules in 1882, most notably the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1882. Now, the delay becomes even more puzzling when one considers the 1868 Burlington Treaty between the U.S. and the Imperial Qing Dynasty that sought to ease the limits on Chinese immigration and protects the rights of already established Chinese. Now, this suggests that there was still a strong opposition to immigration control in the late 1860s. So the adoption of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a scant 14 years later, was a remarkably fast flip. So our research question here is, why such a long lag between backlash and policy actions? And why such a rapid reversal in policy? In case I run out of my time, I'll give you my answer here. Our answer here. Well, our answer is the Civil War altered the political incentive enough to make immigration potential wedge issue in swing states. Now, following the end of the Civil War, the Democrats were stuck with a major electoral disadvantage. States that has contributed large contingents of Union soldiers were unlikely to vote for the Democrats, a party they think associated with the initiation of the war. So as a result, a large block of demographically important states were locked in for Republicans. Now, in each election, the Republicans would wave the bloody shirt, invoking the blood of Union soldiers, spilled because of Democrats who have favored secession. This had a great electoral cost for the Democrats, for whom the main way forward seemed to be to target a few states, such as California, Indiana, and New York. Now, in these states, the anti-immigration policies offer them a way to offset their Civil War-induced disadvantage. California was particularly appealing for Democrats for three reasons. First, the state was growing rapidly. Its number of electoral college votes doubled from 4 to 8 between the 1860s and the 1884 elections. Second, the main foreign-born population of the state, Chinese, roughly of California's population, was the object of intense hostility from native whites. So numerous measures against Chinese workers had been adopted by the state legislature, only to be thwarted by the courts. Third, because they're Chinese, they were not white. The Chinese resident could not vote. So this limited the risk of alienating a portion of the state's electoral. So soon after the Civil War ended, the Democrats had already put forward anti-Chinese proposal in an attempt to compete in California to great electoral success. Right? This transformed California into a swing state. So realizing that Democrats were making headway, Republicans quickly followed suit in the 70s. And by 1880s election, both parties had developed strong anti-Chinese flanks that are virtually indistinguishable from one another. Now, just more a little bit more on the historical background. So the immigration to America picked up noticeably during 1840s and the 1850s. So in states like New York and Massachusetts, an almost immediate nativist backlash was directed at Irish and German immigrants, while states such as California directed the backlash at Chinese. So generally, this took the form of sporadic outbreaks of mob violence and harassment against the immigrants. However, translating this backlash into policy was much more difficult. So actions prior to 1880s were confined to state level and were of limited scope and effect, as we mentioned in the paper before. And it was only in the 1970s that federal legislation became politically feasible. And only in 1882 that a strong piece of anti-immigration legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act, was adopted. For example, at the state level, the most extreme case was that of Massachusetts. So the state mostly aimed at Irish immigrants. Right? However, it was not very effective. So from a number, only 715 out of 33,000 Irish passengers who arrived in Massachusetts between 1837 and 1845 were deported back to Ireland. And moreover, the Massachusetts was an outlier in that it was probably the most aggressive state on the anti-immigration policy, and other states adopted quite mild policies that failed to come close to matching the nativist policies of Massachusetts. For example, the Midwest, they saw the immigration as a way to increase their population and their influence in the Congress. So one reason for the lack in anti-immigration policy action by the federal politicians is that Democrats had a unified voting bloc in the slave-holding southern state. Now, the non-slave states can be broken into two groups. Those are coastal, for example, New York, Massachusetts, and the non-coastal. Those include, for example, Iowa, Wisconsin. So the latter group exhibit a weaker anti-immigration sentiment, notably because, again, the immigration allowed them to grow demographically, right, which secure them more votes in the electoral college and seats in Congress. Now, putting too much weight on immigration topics could divide the northern state and allow Democrats to sneak in, as was in the case in Illinois and New Jersey in the presidential election of 1856. Now, the Civil War altered this dynamic entirely. So first, the Civil War's burden had solidified the Republican coalition in the North, as veterans and their families were solidly opposed to the Democratic Party. And this made it hard for the Democrats to break through in states such as Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. which has sent some of the largest the contingent of troops for the Union cause. Second, in the 1868 election, there were still some states, for example, Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia in the South that could not participate in the election. Third, the politics of the Reconstruction era means until after the election of 1876, many pro-Reconstruction Republicans were in power in many southern states, with their electoral base weakened for most elections until 1880s, and with a more monolithic pro-Republican voting bloc in the North. The Democrats needed to find ways to compete in the presidential elections by catering to marginal states outside the South. Now, the issue that made them competitive in the key states was the advancement of anti-immigration policy. Now, this can be seen in the fact that Democrats frequently nominate politicians from New York, a state that was a hotbed of the anti-immigration feeling and which frequently supported by Democrats during the post-war years for president. However, New York was far from sufficient. So inroads into Midwestern and Western states were necessary. Now, pushing for anti-Chinese policy was one key way the Democrats found to extend to other states, such as California. So one historian argues that the Southern Democrats explicitly picked the Chinese question to create a so-called West-South alliance dedicated to white supremacy and the defeat of Northeastern radicalism. Now, initially, Republicans, they did not want to stray too far from the party's record on civil rights and equal citizenship. However, they were also well aware of the need to court crucial swing voters in the West if they hoped to keep the highly rewarding presidential office under their control. As such, they gradually shifted toward the anti-immigration position in general, and well, in the case of California, anti-Chinese position in particular. So by the late 1880s, anti-immigration policy had achieved bipartisan support. From there, it became increasingly possible for the federal level policy to be enacted and implemented, such as nativist feeling could finally begin to translate into policy action. So our argument so far in the paper essentially predicts that the Democrats move first on anti-immigration policies, and that upon realizing the electoral threat, the Republicans follow later. So the problem with this argument is that why immigrants could vote, which limits the gains from advancing nativist rhetoric. This is why we focus California. So again, why we focus California for 4 reasons. First, the state had a particularly strong nativist backlash against Chinese. Second, the state was also increasingly important in terms of electoral college vote. So by the 1868 election, in which Republicans won by a razor-thin margin of 520 votes, right? It had to become a swing state. Now, in fact, its swing state status could have determined the presidential outcome in 1876. And in that year, it hands its 6th electoral college vote over a 1.8% margin to the Republican candidate, Rutherford Hayes, who had won the election with 185 electoral college votes against 184 for his opponent, Samuel Tilden. Now, California had California switch inside would have cost Hayes the victory. And third, the state fits the pre-war narrative. In my previous paper, I argue, well, part of the lag is explained by the change in economic circumstances, and another part of the lag is due to the fact that many state-level policies, such as 1858 Exclusion Act, were ruled unconstitutional. As such, California experienced the same lag between the backlash and the effective policy responses as elsewhere in the country. And fourth, the most importantly, Asian immigrant, Chinese immigrant, they could not vote. All right? Under the Naturalization Act of 1790, only 3 white men were eligible for citizenship and suffrage. This essentially excluded political participation for Asian immigrants and limited their electoral influence. All right. Now, California then is an ideal case for study that of the shift due to the Civil War that permitted the adoption of federal level policy aimed at curbing immigration. A shift that began with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, in this paper, we look at the presidential election result in Californian counties between 1868 and the 1880s using the following econometric specification, where the absolute value margin between Republicans and Democrats is our measure of electoral competitiveness. Using the absolute value allows us to disregard which party wins in a given county and concentrate exclusively on how competitive a county is. Right? As lower value indicate tighter election. So our coefficient of interest is delta, which measures the effect of the ratio of Chinese to white population in a county I on the competitiveness in that county. Now, our assumption is that the counties that had a large Chinese population relative to the white population yielded a closer contest, as they were key to shifting the state's allegiance in presidential elections. Now, our vectors contains relevant control variable that we use. Those include the local population, the local manufacturing wages, and either the local manufacturing output per capita or the ratio of manufacturing to farming sector. And these variables are meant to control for other socio-economic determinant of the competitiveness. So the results obtained using our specific econometric specification 1 would be useful, but they're not sufficient. So by using an absolute margin of victory regardless of party, we're assuming that Democrats become more competitive and the Republican response produce the same coefficient. So this is an imperfect approach. As such, we use a second specification centered on the Republican response, where in this specification, right, where the GOP swing is the swing towards against the Republican Party relative to the 1868 election. And the 1868 election serves as a base, as it was the first year in which Republicans realized the danger of not adopting anti-Chinese policy. We should expect the swing to fall gradually and eventually become insignificant, leading up to the 1880s election, at which point the Republicans should no longer suffer a penalty associated with Chinese. Now, this setup will rely on the same variable and similar design with the closest census to the election acting as a provider of a control variable. The results from the regressions confirm our intuition to some extent. Now, the ratio of Chinese to white people in a county makes that county more electorally competitive in a presidential election. This applies for all elections. First, we ran the multivariate regression in OLS with each of the different elections. The results are shown in the table, and each pair of a column represent an election with two different specifications. Now, the difference in each pair is that one relies on the local manufacturing output, and the other measures how important the agricultural sector was relative to the manufacturing sector. As can be seen, all columns report that the Chinese to white ratio reduces the absolute value of the victory margin in a county. The effect is always significant about 10% level, and it often significant about 5% level. Most importantly, the coefficients are quite large in our result. So as a ratio is expressed in decimal place, right, that is 1 Chinese to 10 whites is 0.1. Our coefficient implies that 1 extra Chinese per 100 whites reduce the margin of victory by between 0.135 and 0.352 percentage points. So to provide context to this proportion, the election of 1876 could have tipped to the Democrats had they been able to get less than 1% of California's Republican voter to switch sides. Now, the evolution of the coefficient for the ratio of Chinese to whites is also consistent with our explanation. Its importance diminishes monotonically from election to election. So this can be seen in this figure. We expect that Democrats initially got significant returns from adopting anti-Chinese policies. However, as Republicans realized that the electoral cost of appearing pro-Chinese in California, they adopted increasingly hostile proposal. This blurs the difference between them on these key topics, such that it minimizes the electoral advantage conferred by endorsing anti-Chinese policy. More importantly, the results of this figure suggests that bipartisan support for anti-Chinese policy in the late 1870s, more precisely, the need to negate the electoral advantage of the early mover, right? That is the Democrats on anti-Chinese policy. However, our use of absolute margin assumed the effect of adopting the anti-Chinese policy was identical for Democrats and Republicans. So this is why we try a second specification here, in which we employ the vote share swing relative to 1868 as a dependent variable. So this choice of specification is because the Republican pivot on Chinese policy begins after 1868. Had the Republicans preserved their initial policy, we should expect the swing they suffered in the 1868 election to be permanent. However, as they shifted their position, the swing relative to 1868 should gradually fall. This is what we observe. So relative to 1868, the Republicans in 1872 saw their votes share fall as the Chinese population grew relative to white population. Now that reduction was modestly smaller in 1876 and no longer significant in 1880s, implying that the Republicans no longer suffer from being perceived as being less anti-Chinese than Democrats. Now, these results explain well the fact that the 1880 election was fought between the two presidential candidates that defended significant restriction on Chinese immigration. Now, a sense of the inevitability surrounds the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, as neither party appeared willing to take any other stand than massive restriction of the Chinese immigration. As such, the decades-long period of federal inaction in terms of immigration policy in the face of fear of clear nativist backlash came to an end. And we also found more evidence from the roll call votes from the Congressional voting record. So this is a roll call votes record from March 1869. Congressman from California called for a vote to exclude Chinese, or they call it the Mongolian, shall never become voters back then. And you can see they faced a strong opposition from the Republican Party. Almost virtually all Republicans, they voted against such a measure. And now the next voting record, we can observe the shift. Right now, this bill is called the 15-passenger bill. That means, okay, for every vessel came to the United States, cannot carry more than 15 Chinese passengers on its vessel. And you can see almost half of the Republicans, they switched their stance on the anti-Chinese issues. And the interesting thing about this bill is it got vetoed by President Hayes, but the reason was not in favor for Chinese. Hayes vetoed this, and he said, okay, we need to revise our treaty with Chinese, and we will have more power on regulating the Chinese immigration. And the last piece of evidence, roll calling evidence we found is from the actual 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And you can see, all right, basically everybody, all right, majority of the Congress, they voted yes to exclude Chinese. All right. Now, our results and arguments should be seen as complementary to those already advanced by historians and economic historians, rather than as substitute. For example, one historian argued that the few northeastern states, such as New York and Massachusetts, they had strong nativist constitutions, develop bureaucracy that both advocated for federal intervention and later implemented federal policy. Now, our explanation complements this historian's view in the sense that the politicians saw greater returns to listening to immigration control bureaucrats from New York or Massachusetts, and also hiring them to implement policy. Now, others emphasize the importance of nativist feelings. So our explanation complements theirs by providing a channel by which they were converted into federal policy. Now, this complementarity is important. Now, given the rising importance of immigration policy discussion across the Western world, this complementarity, even for historical case such as the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, can provide key insight into understanding the determinants of policy change today. And that's my presentation for today.
Thank you, Lee, for that overview. Excellent. All right, so let's open it up to questions. Let's just like use the raise hand. If you have a question, then do the reaction, and that will allow us to have a queue, and we can take it from there. Okay. All right. Okay. So I actually have a couple of questions to ask people. Oh, and Maria there. Okay, Maria, you go first. I'll wait. Okay.
That's okay. You can go first.
Oh, okay. No, it's fine. It's fine. I'll collect my thoughts better. So thank you for raising your hand. Yeah.
Okay then. So I very much like your project, and your work is really very, very important and very, very good. There's one suggestion and one question that I would like to pose to you. The suggestion is to emphasize more the complementarity of your explanation with the existing explanation, because I think that it's important to not to dismiss the racist tones or the racist motivations that were behind the Exclusion Act. And those can be reflected in a medium water, as a medium water approach. So I think that the fact that you can show it through the voting pattern is a very strong indication in the sense of the presence of medium water as well, right? So I think that would be like a very, very nice way to emphasize the complementarity of your work, which again is really fantastic. The question that I have is instead related to the, I guess, two parts of a question, related to the different composition of the Chinese, meaning that does it make any difference the fact that in time the, again, Chinese population changes from being basically exclusively male to being more mixed? And the other question that is related to this is if the Chinese Massacre of 1871 has any effect in the policies or in the positioning of the different parties.
Maria, thanks for your kind words, and thanks for the great questions. So as regard to the male or female population, we're actually still, Vincent and I, we're still trying to figure out the gender composition of the Chinese. And they actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because in 1875, the congressman from California, Horace Page, he actually got the Congress to pass the Page Act of 1875. That means to prohibit the importation of coolie. That's why they call the cheap Chinese labor as slave labor and the Chinese woman. Because back then, okay, a lot of them say, okay, the Chinese woman, they're most of them with the bias, right? They think they're prostitute, and importing a Chinese woman, that means we're increasing prostitution in our society, and that's bad for the country. So I think in 1875 they actually passed the legislation. But I was not able to find the voting record, so that was kind of a bummer. And with regard to 1871, the massacre, I think I have not focused on the massacre, but I know that was triggered by the Chinese population in the manufacturing sector in I think San Francisco.
It was in Los Angeles.
Oh, Los Angeles, okay.
And it was more linked to the laundering. Like literally like washing clothes. That's the main business of the Chinese, because because of the gold mining, like they were brought in to wash the clothes.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I need to take a closer look at the massacre, because I do recall when I was doing the research. Okay, it's the one thing about the Chinese Massacre came out, but I didn't pay a closer attention to that. But thank you for bringing that out.
Okay, great. So let me jump in with my question. So yeah, I like this project very much too, but I think there might be So like you're giving one perspective, right, of the very complex transformation. And what I was looking for, and maybe that's a separate project, is the sort of the active voice that transfer, or the activity of transferring the hurt of some people being, like some people are hurt by immigrants, right? And in terms of wages or whatever other ways there might be hurt. But how do we go from that to the hatred, to the really long-lasting hatred for 4 decades, right? So I mean, it's not like everyone in society was hurt. And Adam Martin has this paper about entangled political economy being the talkative political economy, with things like persuasion and ideology being important, and like this. And in particular, I here would think of like ideological entrepreneurs. So have you, and I'm not saying this needs to be in this paper, probably not, but like, have you seen anything about this in your research? And yeah, like how was the hatred kindled over time?
Yes, actually, I just actually published a paper last year on this topic. So the title of that paper is "The Political Economy of Anti-Chinese Movement in California in the 19th Century." So in that paper, I solely focused on the anti-Chinese movement in California. So basically, I said in that paper, I developed some kind of model, like a qualitative model, to study the anti-Chinese movement, and by drawing on the previous lecture. So the model in that paper suggests the adverse economic condition in the labor market, the direct competition between the Chinese workers and native white workers, and the well-organized native labor, and the durable legislation that explain why there was a 3-decade lag between the first wave of Chinese agitation and the passage of the Exclusion Act. And I think in that paper, I argue that model can also explain why the organized labor to the influence of politics in California.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, and we have now questions from Michaela and then Pedro. So let's go to Michaela. Yeah.
I believe that Pedro raised his hand prior to me. So Pedro.
Shall I then? Okay. Thank you, Linan. Thank you, Vincent. Great project. So my knowledge about pre-Civil War US is a bit limited. So, but I was curious with a couple points. So I get the tale that, okay, because that keeping the position that the Republicans had on migration would like be enough to lose the elections. They kind of, okay, that let's change that policy so we can keep preference there and so on. Okay, but I am only getting the tale that there is only one possible policy that might be in competition. So I was curious about like the opportunity cost in relation to other policies. Would that nothing else that they could have altered to compensate for the loss in migration? So I was kind of curious about that game between possible policies that could have been played instead of just the migration one, and if the opportunity cost was really, this was the only way that they could held, and then things like that, if that took place in other areas, maybe in other states, like that they decided to change other things to compensate the loss. So, and then, okay, this is one on the tail of like, if there were other options to not lose to the Democrats. And I had a question on the methodology. So you focus on federal elections, the presidential, and I think Congress. Couldn't we also have learned something from the local elections as well, state elections and all that? So why not analyze that data as well? So thank you, great project.
Thank you, Pedro. To your second question, you taken my mind fresh. To the second question, I think for our we're actually looking at the county level presidential election data, but I think for the previous paper I wrote, I mostly focused on the in-state level, the California state level election, and I was able to find in that project I was able to find so I was not so here's the two things. I was not able to find like the difference, like their voting stand between the Democrats and Republicans. But the thing is, since the 1867, there was a big change, and in the before the 1868 gubernatorial election, it was Governor Low, and he was very he's in a position to support the Chinese. But I think that might have cost him the governorship after that. And I think 1868 was a very very crucial year. And that's why we use our 1868 as our base year for our second econometric specification to test, okay, what kind of move the Republican made to avoid this kind of penalty. Yeah. Oh, what was your first question? I slipped through my mind.
Was on the if there would be any value to analyze all the possible options that the Republicans might have had, like in change of policies, okay, to compensate. So let's keep being a migration-friendly party, but let's maybe concede on something else. So was there any debate on that side, or was migration kind of the easier one for them to move forward?
Yes, so I think we mentioned that. Am I muted? Oh, I'm not muted. Sorry, I somehow I'm still muted. So we mentioned that in the paper about the 1876 presidential election. So basically, it was Rutherford Hayes against Samuel Tilden, and the electoral vote was 185 to 184, and that means, all right. So California, they're so anti-Chinese, so anti-Chinese. Had Hayes lost California 6 vote, that will cost him the victory. So we emphasize, yes, it's very, very important to capture the 6 votes from California. Yeah.
All right, I guess so. Michaela, yeah.
Thanks very much, Marta, and congratulations, Linan and Vince, for a very, very interesting paper. So a comment first before proceeding to questions. So the relevance to entangle political economy, I think, is reasonably obvious. So one only need to draw upon a very underrated but quite important paper that Vince himself wrote in 2016 in the journal Economic Affairs, referring to network connections among social groups. And I sort of had a little rejoinder to that. And in if you don't mind me saying, my 2018 book on inequality sort of refers to the linkages between political discrimination of minority groups and their subsequent inability to actually entangle with other groups and societies in productive ways, because they're sort of basically locked out of network access. So here is the implication. Twofold questions, if I may, Lee. So my first question is in relation to how do we actually define a Chinese person? Because I'm quite aware of, in other Anglosphere countries back at the time, a lot of debate and contestation about what is actually to define given identities. I can refer, for example, to what I'm quite familiar with in Australia, what defines an Indigenous person. So, you know, people went into these sort of pseudo-scientific and quite terrible eugenicist type of experiments and sort of policy designs about sort of bloodlines and things like that. I wonder whether similar issues are maybe prevalent in the US case with respect to defining the Chinese population. Hence, some people would seek to not define themselves as Chinese in order to avoid these sort of discriminatory and exclusionary pieces of legislation. And the second question I have now, apologies if I might have been a touch inattentive, did you actually include any kind of consideration, if not variables, in relation to the international policy transmission of these baleful, terrible policies? Because certainly at the time, during the second half of the 19th century, anti-Chinese policies were evident in other parts of the world. For example, anti-Chinese sentiment in Australia against Chinese gold miners in Australia, and some of them actually then moved to California, right? If you know a bit of the history. And so I'm wondering if there's a policy transmission variable that needs to be accounted for, if I hadn't seen that already. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for your kind words and the comments. So with respect to your first question, how to identify Chinese, we're actually able to find our data from the US, the census. They actually give us, okay, here is how many foreign-born Chinese we have in California. And of course, I mean, back then, under the Chinese category, they also say, okay, we also have, okay, out of, let's say out of 10,000 Chinese, so we also have these 28 Japanese. And nonetheless, we're going to incorporate them, identify them as Chinese. And I think the number, I think from our data side, I don't think that affects our conclusion. So yeah, due to the because of definition, because it's insignificant. In the sense, it's a very small portion. All right, so they just classify it in Chinese. And for the other variable from the international trend of the policy, I did a cross with some of the Chinese minor got discriminated in Australia, but I have not pursued on that path. So that is a very good suggestion. Yeah, I'll definitely take a look into that. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And now Nathaniel, Nathan.
Thank you very much for this work. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm wondering if you've considered that there were different rhetoric about Chinese folks coming into the United States on the West Coast as compared to the East Coast. The conditions in California really was a competition for free labor, for laborers that had immigrated freely of their own accord. Whereas on the East Coast, the primary concern was about inservitude, people who were being imported rather than those who had immigrated of their own volition.
Oh, thank you, Nathaniel. So can you repeat your last part of your question?
Yes, the concern in the newspapers and the rhetoric on the East Coast had primarily to do with Chinese workers who were being imported by businessmen, and they came under contracts that were over several years, and the expectation was that after that time they would be sent back to China. Whereas on the West Coast in California, for example, most of the Chinese folks who had come to the United States had immigrated freely. A lot of them planned on going back, by the way, right? But there was a difference in the concern. On the West Coast, white workers were concerned for competition from free migration, and on the East Coast, workers were concerned by the importation of labor. On the East Coast, it seems to me it was more a discussion of labor versus industry, labor versus capitalists, whereas on the West Coast it was labor versus labor.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was able to find a piece of evidence to see there was one congressman from Massachusetts. He actually proposed against the coolie trade, so-called coolie trade, slave labor, because I think from his stance, he genuinely cared about people being slave labor, and it's very bad for us to use slave labor in our country. But on the West Coast, the people's concern, they're like, yes, they're very cheap labor, and the white labor cannot survive on the much money made by the Chinese. And I think like the first big wave of Chinese immigration, they were attracted by the gold rush, and they certainly has to do with some kind of propaganda from I think from the U.S. Then say, okay, here is the land of gold. And matter of fact, San Francisco in Chinese literally means a gold mountain, right? For Chinese, and they say, yeah, we're going to go gold mountain, and we're gonna get rich. And yes, that they did plan to, some of them they did plan to go back after,
I think there's a great quote in Tim Leonard's book about the progressive era, where I think it's in there where he mentions how the white man can only subsist on meat and potatoes, whereas the Chinese can get by on just rice. So it's just not fair that we allow people to come in and so the idea was to push out migrants that way.
Yes. I was able to find the data on how much the Chinese, so this is not the miner, but the railroad workers building the railroad. So a Chinese salary was about $28 or $30. And the Chinese worker, they have to provide their own like housing and the food, right? But for the white labor, the base salary was like $36. And the company has had to provide them the food and the housing. So it was a rational choice for the railroad construction company to employ more Chinese.
Okay, I have one more question. So in the opening of the paper, you talk about some state policies that even if they were adopted, they were often overturned by courts. So who challenged those policies? Yeah.
Okay, so in the case of California, for example, there were I don't recall the exact name. So it was a policy about like charging $3 per Chinese person in the mining industry, and levy some kind of monthly tax, additional monthly tax on them. The tax bill lasted for a while because nobody was overturning the bill, and the Chinese, they were fine. They're just okay, more tax on us, that's just cost of doing business, but we're still gonna stay here, stay in California, stay in the mining industry. It was actually I think it's the Supreme Court of California, they overturned those state level policies.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Let's give it a moment for more questions. If anything else comes up.
What do you know about the conventions, the Republican convention in 1880, and the role that this Chinese issue played in determining who would be the candidate in 1880?
That is a great question. I'm currently looking at the Republican convention right before the meeting. So yeah, I will find out.
Excuse me, Linan, if I may, can I just sort of come again to this question about the definition of the Chinese person? I wonder if there's any literature at the time, or even any subsequent secondary literature that refers to the failings of tax enforcement, because we actually don't really know how to define a Chinese person. Actually, people can have mixed ancestry. East Asia is a big place, as we know, right? So it's just not mainland Chinese people. So I just wonder whether those sort of questions of identity, a variegated identity, really sort of play a role in the ultimate perceived futility of and cost of tax enforcement.
That's a very great question. So I don't know about how they enforce the tax on Chinese, the group of people per se, but I do know the state government of California, they actually the enforcement mechanism was not very effective. Matter of fact, they will not be able to generate a significant tax revenue from that. And I think one of the governors specifically said is that, okay, it's not very effective. Maybe we probably just overturn like the tax bill on Chinese in the mining industry. But regarding how they can actually identify Chinese miner and tax them, I do not have the answer for that. Yeah.
Okay. So you kind of stress out in your narrative that this is a long timeline between like the median voter sort of emotions, right, around the issue and actual policy. Have you, so like, what are we comparing this to, right? Like, what are some other timelines that are shorter? Like, I have a hard, like, because if it was a different issue, right, like maybe we would just blame, well, this is, the government is never effective and it takes forever for everything. So I don't know, I don't have the intuition what the regular timeline would be, but maybe you have thought about that. Yeah.
That's a very good question. I have not thought about like the regular timeline, how you will be effective against the immigration. But I did find the timeline at the state level, they're actually very quick. For example, so the first wave of the Chinese migrant, they came to California in, I think it was in 1852, I believe. And the state of California, they quickly adopted a tax bill on Chinese, I think in 1854, I believe, the very first tax bill. So in that sense, at the state level, they were very fast. They're very fast at responding to the Chinese issue.
Okay, great. So, and this is also like a smaller thing, but in the paper, like you make a very strong case, right? That the backlash was the strongest in California, non-existent in the Midwest, and so on and so forth. But how do you measure it, right? Like is it historical accounts or I don't know, newspaper records? Yeah, like how do we know that? I'm not I'm not questioning that we know it. It's just like, how do we, I don't know, is there a way to quantify it? Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely need to take a deeper look at how to quantify, if it's possible to quantify like Midwestern states' attitude towards Chinese. We just assume because, well, the Midwestern state in Indiana, they need the population to gain advantage in the Congress. We just assume that, and we have not been able to quantify the attitude. So we would definitely take a deeper look into that.
Yeah, and I think that's that will be kind of interesting, and especially with that sort of the political entrepreneurship, right, that we talk about, because some of it is just the rough numbers, but some of this is the ideological sort of entrepreneurial creativity, right, and creating this hatred and emotions and sentiments. Yeah.
And
okay.
Sorry. And that was actually one of the reasons I just finished going through every congressional record from 1860 to 1860 to 1882 to find like okay, what did people say? What did congressmen or senators say? They said about the Chinese issue, and of course, most of the Chinese comment, they were from the California senators and the congressmen. And I think we might be able to quantify it by just looking at the voting record I recently found to say, okay, how many the senator or congressman they from Midwestern state, they voted against the Chinese issue or I mean the support the anti-Chinese issue or against the anti-Chinese issue. I think that might be a way to go.
Excellent. All right, great. And then I see Nathan with his hand up. So
yeah, this just occurred to me. We often like to look for bootleggers of Baptists in different policies. And I'm wondering, how did the Tongs respond to the Chinese Exclusion Act? Were they happy to see the Chinese Exclusion Act put in place because it gave them more power in like the coyotes of China at the time period? Did it give them more influence and power in China and also amongst the Chinese who were in the United States at the time?
That's a very, very great question. Actually, in my previous paper, I look at the Tong's attitude, and of course the six the six companies, I believe those are called, and I just skipped I actually in my previous paper I decided to skip those because those are too complicated to include in the paper, and it's hard to say their general attitude towards that because there was not a good record to show, okay, if they actually try to help their fellow Chinese or not.
But was there more pushback against the Tongs after, like in China, after the Chinese Exclusion Act? Like, did they become a problem within China? That might be something to look. I don't know if there's any way to find that out though. Yeah.
Yeah, that I do not know. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't see any other questions. Yes. Well, that just means we're very, very efficient and productive. So thank you all for that. Linan, if there are any other comments or anything else you want to share, is there any final words?
Yeah, well, actually, so in my previous paper, to start the paper I published in last year, I was actually, that paper was inspired by a TV show, so it's called The Warriors. If you all like action-packed TV show, you should definitely watch that. It's by Bruce Lee. Like they found that script after his death. So yes, it's on HBO Max if you're interested.
Okay. Well, great. So it's a paper and a show recommendation. Very good. That's a good way to close the seminar. So thank you all for coming, and I will see you in December, and I will follow up with details about that upcoming seminar. So thank you, Lee. Great presentation, very informative. Most appreciated.
Marta, can you leave the room open? I know Nathaniel suggested he wanted to suggest something that was going to take some time to me and Lee. Can we still use the room for a few minutes?
Sure. So what do? I just end it for myself, or wait?
I'm not sure. I'm just wondering if it's possible. If not, we can coordinate something individually, if you prefer.
I think that I click end, and then I think I can do it, and if not, we will be disconnected, and then you have to figure it out on your own. So let me try.
Okay, that's a deal.
There you go. Okay, yes, and I can assign you as a new host. So Vincent, it's gonna be you. Okay.